Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk to you today about a prayer we all need to pray more often. God, give me clarity. Now you might be wondering, why clarity? Why not just pray for answers? Because here's the truth, clarity isn't just about having all the details laid out before you. Clarity is about seeing clearly enough to take the next step with faith. Clarity is more than just a nice to have. It's essential for navigating life with purpose and confidence. When we're unclear about something, whether it's a decision, a relationship, or our purpose in life, it's easy to feel lost, confused, or even paralyzed by indecision. The noise of uncertainty can overwhelm us, leaving us wondering which path to take, what step to make next, or whether we're even headed in the right direction at all. Without clarity, we can make decisions out of fear, impulse, or pressure. We may settle for what's easiest or what others expect of us instead of pursuing the path that God has designed for us. Clarity isn't just about knowing what's ahead, it's about seeing with the eyes of faith. When we have clarity, we're able to make decisions that are aligned with God's will for our lives. It enables us to discern the right choices, reject distractions, and walk in the fullness of His purpose. Think about it. When you have clarity, you no longer stumble through life. You know where you're going, even if you don't have the whole journey mapped out. It's like being in the middle of a foggy morning. When the sun rises and the fog starts to lift, you suddenly see the path before you more clearly. You can walk with confidence because the fog of confusion is being removed. Clarity is also the key to peace. When we don't have it, we feel anxious, we second guess ourselves, we wrestle with doubt. But when God brings clarity to our situation, it's like a calm assurance that settles in our hearts. We know we're on the right track, even if the road ahead still has some twists and turns. Clarity helps us quiet the noise of our doubts and trust that God's guidance is enough for the next step. And let's not forget that clarity is what helps us prioritize. In a world full of distractions, it's easy to get pulled in every direction. But when we have clarity, we understand what matters most. We can focus our energy on the things that are in alignment with our purpose. It's like having a clear vision. Everything else fades into the background, and we can zero in on what God has called us to do. Clarity doesn't just guide us in making big decisions, it's also crucial in our day-to-day lives. It helps us navigate the challenges we face, gives us direction when we're unsure, and assures us that, despite the uncertainty around us, we're never walking alone. The more we seek God for clarity, the more we begin to recognize His voice, His presence, and His guidance in our everyday lives. Asking for clarity is not just a passive request, it's a powerful act of faith. When we ask God for clarity, we acknowledge our need for His wisdom, His guidance, and His understanding. It's a reminder that we are not self-sufficient, that we cannot navigate life on our own. Asking is an act of humility. It's saying, God, I don't have all the answers, but I trust that you do. In that simple act, we shift our perspective from one of self-reliance to one of trust in the one who holds all the answers. There's a deep power in asking because it positions us in a place of dependence on God. When we ask, we show God that we are open to receiving from Him. Asking for clarity isn't just about getting an answer. It's about positioning ourselves to hear His voice and trust in His timing. Often when we ask, we open the door for God to move in ways that we didn't expect. He's not just answering our prayer with information, He's shaping our hearts and building our trust. Think about it, asking is the key that unlocks God's provision and wisdom. Without asking, we remain stuck in our own understanding, limited by our own perspective. But when we ask, we open ourselves to the infinite wisdom of God. This is not just about receiving clarity in our minds, it's about receiving the peace that comes with knowing that God is working on our behalf. We might not understand everything, but when we ask for clarity, we invite God to lead us step by step, providing what we need in each moment. The power of asking also lies in the fact that it activates our faith. Faith without action is dead. And asking is an action that demonstrates our belief in God's ability to guide us. When we ask for clarity, we are stepping out in faith, knowing that God will reveal His will in His perfect timing. It's a declaration that we believe God cares about our decisions, our struggles, and our future. We are not just passively waiting for clarity to fall from the sky, we are actively seeking it from the one who has the answers. There's another layer to the power of asking. It aligns our hearts with God's purpose. When we ask for clarity, we are essentially saying, God, I want to understand your will, not just my own desires. It's an act of surrender where we relinquish control and trust that God's plan for us is far greater than anything we could imagine. Asking for clarity isn't just about receiving guidance for the next step. It's about aligning our hearts and minds with His purposes, ensuring that our desires are in harmony with His. Asking also opens the door for intimacy with God. The more we ask, the more we engage in conversation with Him. Asking is an invitation for God to speak into our lives. It's not a one-sided transaction, but a relational exchange. God wants to reveal Himself to us, and when we ask for clarity, we create space for Him to speak, whether through His word, His Spirit, or the wisdom of others. This constant communication deepens our relationship with Him, strengthening our faith and trust in His leadership. Ultimately, asking is the beginning of a journey. It's the first step toward breaking through confusion and stepping into the clarity that only God can provide. It's a powerful act that not only changes our circumstances, but also transforms our hearts. When we ask, we open ourselves up to a deeper understanding of God's will, and we position ourselves to receive the clarity we need to walk faithfully in the direction He's calling us. Clarity is a gift that many of us long for. It's that moment when the fog lifts, when everything seems to fall into place, and we can see the path clearly before us. But what many don't realize is that faith plays a pivotal role in receiving the clarity we seek. It's through faith that we are able to receive God's guidance, trust in His timing, and move forward even when the full picture isn't yet visible. Faith isn't simply about believing in something that's hard to understand. It's about trusting God in the unknown. Often, clarity doesn't come immediately. Sometimes, God only gives us the next step, not the entire blueprint for our lives. In these moments, faith is the fuel that propels us forward. When we don't have all the answers, faith helps us trust that the answers will come in time, and that God is leading us even when we can't fully see the way ahead. Think about the story of Abraham. God called him to leave everything he knew and go to a place he had never seen. God didn't give him a map or even a specific destination. He simply said, "Go to the land I will show you." That was all Abraham had. And yet, Abraham's faith enabled him to take that first step, even though he had no idea where he was going or how the journey would unfold. His faith wasn't based on the clarity of the situation. It was based on his trust in God's promises and character. It was his faith that gave him the courage to step out into the unknown. And it was that same faith that allowed him to receive the clarity he needed along the way. When we are waiting for clarity, it can feel like we're walking in the dark, but faith is like a flashlight. It doesn't necessarily light up the entire path, but it illuminates enough for us to take the next step. Faith allows us to trust God's timing, knowing that He will reveal His plans when we are ready to receive them. Too often we want all the answers right away. We want to know the whole story before we start the journey. But that's not how faith works. Faith requires us to take the first step without knowing everything. It requires us to trust that God is not withholding clarity, but is providing it in the way that's best for us. Faith also gives us the strength to persevere in times of uncertainty. When we're unsure, when we're in the middle of waiting for answers, faith is the anchor that keeps us grounded. It is easy to become frustrated when we don't have immediate clarity. It's easy to grow impatient and want to force things to happen. But faith reminds us that God's timing is perfect and He's always working behind the scenes. Just because we don't have clarity today doesn't mean we won't have it tomorrow. Faith helps us trust that clarity will come, even when it feels delayed or out of reach. Moreover, faith transforms how we approach uncertainty. Rather than seeing uncertainty as something to fear, faith allows us to see it as an opportunity for God to work. It's in the waiting, the trusting, and the believing that God strengthens our character and deepens our relationship with Him. Faith isn't just about receiving clarity. It's about allowing the process of waiting to shape us. It's in these moments that God refines us, building our patience, our dependence on Him, and our resilience. The absence of immediate clarity isn't a sign of God's absence. It's an opportunity to grow in our trust and understanding of Him. When we approach clarity with faith, we stop trying to control the outcome. Faith is the recognition that we are not in charge, but God is. We may not always understand why things aren't clear yet, but faith allows us to surrender to God's will. It's a release of the need to have all the answers and an embrace of the trust that in His time, He will reveal what we need to know. Furthermore, faith opens our eyes to see things from a divine perspective. It shifts our focus from our limitations to God's limitless power. When we place our faith in God, we begin to see possibilities that we couldn't see before. Our vision expands, and we realize that clarity isn't just about having the right answers, it's about aligning ourselves with God's greater purpose. Faith helps us recognize that clarity is not just a personal revelation, it's a glimpse of God's kingdom and His plan for us. With faith, we move from being trapped in our own understanding to seeing the world through the lens of God's promises. Ultimately, faith is the bridge between where we are now and the clarity we're seeking. It's what sustains us in the waiting, what empowers us to take the next step when the path ahead is unclear, and what enables us to trust that God will guide us in His perfect timing. When we have faith, we can rest assured that the clarity we need will come. We don't have to force it or rush it. We just need to trust God, take the steps He leads us to, and wait for His revelation in the right moment. One of the most profound aspects of the Christian faith is the recognition that God operates on His own perfect timeline, one that often doesn't align with our own. We live in a world where everything moves quickly, where instant gratification is at our fingertips, and where we expect things to happen on our terms. Yet God's timing is not dictated by the rush of our world. Instead, it's rooted in His eternal wisdom and His perfect understanding of what we need and when we need it. Understanding and accepting God's timing requires us to embrace patience, which is a cornerstone of faith. Patience is an often misunderstood virtue in today's culture. We view it as merely waiting for something to happen, as if the waiting itself is the entire process. But biblical patience is more than just passive waiting. It's an act of trusting God's sovereignty and an acknowledgement that His plan is always better than our own. Patience is not just a test of time, it's a test of faith. It challenges us to trust that God knows what He's doing, even when we can't see the full picture. Consider the story of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. For 40 years, they waited for God to bring them to the promised land. They faced challenges, frustrations, and doubts. And during that time, God's timing often didn't make sense to them. Why did they have to wait so long? Why didn't God just bring them to their destination immediately? But in those 40 years, God was working on their hearts. He was teaching them patience, dependence on Him, and trust in His plan. It wasn't just about getting to the promised land, it was about preparing them to receive the promise. God's timing can be difficult for us to grasp because it often doesn't align with our own understanding of what is best for us. We may think we're ready for something, whether it's a new opportunity, a relationship, or a breakthrough. But God sees beyond the present moment into the depths of our hearts and the future that lies ahead. He knows when we're truly ready for the blessings He has in store for us. What we view as a delay, God views as preparation. For example, think about David's journey to becoming king. God anointed him as a young shepherd, but he didn't immediately step into the throne. Instead, David spent years in the wilderness, running from King Saul and facing intense trials. Those years of waiting and suffering were not wasted. They were part of God's process of preparing David's heart for the leadership he was called to. David had to learn patience, trust, and humility in the midst of his struggles. His anointing wasn't a promise of immediate success. It was a call to trust God's timing. And when the time came, God positioned David perfectly, and the kingdom was ready for him. God's timing also involves understanding that His ways are higher than ours. We may be in a season of waiting, feeling like we've been sidelined or forgotten. But God is never in a hurry. His delays are not denials. His timing is always intentional, purposeful, and designed to accomplish His greater plan for us. This means we have to let go of our own timeline and trust that God's delays are not a rejection of our desires, but a redirection to something better. It's a shift from God, hurry up, to God, I trust you. In these seasons of waiting, patience strengthens our character. It teaches us to persevere, to hope against hope, and to believe that even when we don't see the results, God is still working. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans 5:3-4 that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. Patience in the waiting seasons allows God to refine us. It strips away our pride, our impatience, and our dependence on our own abilities, replacing them with a deeper trust in His timing and wisdom. Waiting on God's timing also deepens our relationship with Him. When we're in a season of uncertainty, we're forced to lean on God in ways we wouldn't if everything were going according to our plan. God uses the waiting period to draw us closer to Him, to teach us to rely on His presence rather than our circumstances. It's in the waiting that we develop a deeper understanding of who He is and what it means to trust Him fully. The waiting becomes a process of sanctification, where God transforms our hearts and minds. It's also crucial to recognize that patience doesn't mean passivity. While we wait on God's timing, we don't sit idle. We continue to grow, continue to serve, and continue to live faithfully in the present moment. God's timing doesn't mean we stop seeking, stop praying, or stop preparing. Instead, it's about moving forward with the understanding that God is the one orchestrating the steps. We do what we can, but we trust that God will bring about the right timing for everything else. Ultimately, God's timing and patience are intertwined. Patience is just the ability to wait. It's the ability to wait with trust, knowing that God's timing is always perfect. His delays are not signs of abandonment, but opportunities for growth and preparation. As we trust in His timing, we learn to lean more deeply into His character and His promises, knowing that He is always working, even when we cannot see it. And as we learn to wait with patience, we come to understand that His plan is greater than anything we could have orchestrated on our own. In our fast-paced world, it's easy to feel the pressure to move quickly, to rush ahead, make decisions, and seize opportunities before they pass us by. We live in an age of instant gratification, where we're conditioned to expect immediate results, quick fixes, and fast-paced progress. However, when it comes to matters of faith, purpose, and clarity, rushing ahead can lead to missteps, frustration, and even long-term consequences. There is a significant danger in moving forward without clarity, wisdom, or God's guidance, and this is why we must resist the urge to rush ahead in our own understanding and trust in God's timing. The first danger of rushing ahead is the risk of making decisions out of impatience or fear rather than faith. When we're in a place of uncertainty or confusion, we often feel the pressure to act, even if we're not ready. We might think that moving forward quickly will solve our problems or relieve our anxiety, but more often than not, this kind of hasty action only leads to further complications. The impulse to rush can come from a place of insecurity, fear of missing out, or a desire to control our circumstances. We try to take things into our own hands rather than waiting for God's guidance. And in doing so, we may make decisions that don't align with His plan for our lives. Consider the story of Sarah and Abraham in the Bible. God had promised them a child. But as time passed and they didn't see the promise fulfilled, Sarah took matters into her own hands. She encouraged Abraham to have a child with her servant, Hagar, because she believed the promise was delayed or perhaps impossible. But rushing ahead of God's timing and trying to force the promise to happen led to heartache, jealousy, and division within the family. Their impatience brought unintended consequences. God's promise was still valid, but it would be fulfilled in His time, not theirs. Another danger of rushing ahead is the potential for making decisions without the wisdom or clarity that comes from waiting on God. Clarity requires patience. When we act too quickly, we may not have the full picture. We may miss important details or overlook key insights that God would reveal to us if we took the time to pause and listen. Without clarity, we can find ourselves on paths that lead to frustration, regret, and unnecessary detours. Moving too quickly might also cause us to make choices based on incomplete information, which can result in poor outcomes. Think of the Israelites when they were about to enter the Promised Land. God had been leading them through the desert for years, and the time had come for them to step into the land He had promised them. However, they didn't immediately enter the land. Instead, they were told to wait for God's perfect timing and His clear instructions. When they rushed ahead on their own, they faced defeat and setback. In Numbers 14, after refusing to enter the land when God had commanded them, they attempted to take matters into their own hands and march forward without His blessing, only to be struck with failure and loss. Their failure was a direct result of not waiting for God's direction. Rushing ahead also leads us to rely on our own strength, which often falls short. We might have the skills, resources, and determination to push through a situation, but when we act without God's direction, we rely on our own understanding rather than His wisdom. The Bible warns against leaning on our own understanding, saying in Proverbs 3:5-6, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." Our limited perspective cannot compare to God's infinite wisdom. Rushing ahead without His input is like driving without a map, hoping we'll reach our destination despite not knowing the way. There's also a spiritual danger in rushing ahead. We risk losing the peace that comes from walking in step with God. When we act out of our own timing and our own urgency, we disrupt the rhythm of God's peace in our lives. God's guidance often comes with a sense of calm assurance, even in the midst of uncertainty. When we rush, that peace evaporates, and we're left with anxiety, second guessing, and a constant sense of unrest. The Bible speaks of peace that surpasses all understanding, Philippians 4:7, and this peace can only be experienced when we trust in God's timing and move at the pace He sets for us. Moreover, rushing ahead can prevent us from fully learning the lessons that God wants to teach us in the waiting season. Often the delays and periods of waiting are opportunities for spiritual growth, character development, and deeper trust in God. When we rush through these seasons, we miss out on the refining work God wants to do in our hearts. Patience is not just about sitting still. It's about actively trusting, growing, and being shaped by God during the waiting periods. If we skip ahead, we might find ourselves ill-prepared for what's to come, lacking the strength and maturity we need to handle future challenges. Lastly, rushing ahead can lead to a lack of discernment in recognizing God's voice. When we're in a hurry, we don't take the time to listen for God's still small voice. The Bible tells us that God often speaks in quiet moments, not in the noise of our hurried decisions. When we rush, we drown out His voice and fail to hear His guidance. This can lead to decisions based on our own impulses rather than on God's will. In sum, the danger of rushing ahead is that it leads us into decisions made from fear, impatience, and a desire for control. It causes us to rely on our own understanding, ignore God's wisdom, and forfeit the peace that comes from waiting on His timing. The path of wisdom is not the path of haste. It's the path of patience, trust, and obedience to God's perfect plan. When we wait for God's timing, we avoid the missteps that come with rushing and allow Him to guide us in the way that leads to true fulfillment and purpose. Living with expectancy is more than simply hoping for good things to happen. It's a mindset rooted in faith, a belief that God is active, involved, and ready to move in our lives. It's a perspective that transforms how we approach each day, how we face challenges, and how we make decisions. To live with expectancy means to approach life with the anticipation that God is working behind the scenes, even when we cannot see the immediate evidence of it. It's a posture of hope that expects God's promises to come to fruition, even when the path ahead is unclear. At its core, living with expectancy is about anticipating the goodness of God. It's recognizing that God is not distant or inactive, but is always present and at work in our lives, orchestrating the events of our days for our good and His glory. This kind of expectancy shifts our focus from what we lack to what God is about to do. It moves us from a place of doubt or resignation into a place of hope and trust in God's faithful provision. Expectancy changes how we view our circumstances. When we live with expectancy, we no longer see the challenges as setbacks, but as opportunities for God to show up in powerful ways. It's easy to become discouraged when things aren't going as planned or when life feels uncertain. But when we live with expectancy, we hold on to the belief that even in the midst of struggles, God is working on something greater than we can understand in the moment. We expect that God will use the difficulties we face to shape us, teach us, and ultimately lead us to His promises. Consider the example of the Israelites as they waited for the promised land. They faced years of hardship, uncertainty, and wandering in the wilderness. Despite their challenges, they were called to live with expectancy. God had already promised them a land flowing with milk and honey, and they were to hold on to that promise in faith, even as they navigated difficult circumstances. Their expectancy wasn't just wishful thinking. It was rooted in the truth of God's character and His faithfulness to fulfill His promises. Similarly, living with expectancy involves trusting in God's timing, which is often different from our own. We want things to happen quickly, according to our timeline, but God's timing is perfect. Living with expectancy doesn't mean forcing things to happen. It means patiently waiting for God's perfect plan to unfold. Expectancy is not about rushing ahead or manipulating situations, but about resting in the confidence that God is in control and will make everything beautiful in His time. One of the key components of living with expectancy is learning to align our desires with God's will. We often have our own ideas of what should happen and when, but expectancy requires us to surrender our plans to God and trust that He knows what's best. This requires us to actively seek His guidance, to listen for His voice, and to be obedient even when the journey doesn't look like what we imagined. When our hearts align with His will, our expectations are transformed from mere wishes to a deep-rooted faith in God's ability to bring about His purposes in our lives. Living with expectancy also means having the courage to take bold steps forward, even when we don't have all the answers. Expectancy moves us from passivity into action because we are actively engaging with what God is doing. It's not enough to sit back and wait for things to fall into place. We must take the steps that align with what God has promised. Like the disciples when they were called to follow Jesus, living with expectancy means moving forward in faith, trusting that God will provide the direction and the provision as we step out in obedience. Expectancy doesn't just shape our response to challenges, but it influences how we view every opportunity. When we live with expectancy, we approach every situation with the belief that something good is about to happen. It changes how we interact with others, how we approach our work, and how we respond to life's ups and downs. We look for God's hand in every moment, knowing that He is constantly at work, even in the ordinary. Living with expectancy invites us to look for the miracles in the mundane, to see the hand of God in the small moments, and to trust that His goodness is evident all around us. In addition, living with expectancy strengthens our faith. When we expect that God is going to show up, it gives us the strength to persevere difficult times. We know that He hasn't forgotten us and that He will fulfill His promises, even if it takes longer than we anticipated. Expectancy fuels our belief that God is a God of miracles, a God who can bring beauty from ashes and make a way where there seems to be no way. It reminds us that we are not alone in our struggles and that God is working on our behalf, even when we don't see the evidence of it. Furthermore, living with expectancy builds a culture of gratitude. When we are actively looking for God to move, we become more attuned to His blessings, both big and small. We develop eyes to see His goodness in the midst of our daily lives, and our hearts overflow with thanksgiving. Expectancy leads to greater contentment because it shifts our focus from what we don't have to what God is doing right now. When we trust in His goodness and His faithfulness, we learn to be grateful for what He has already done, as well as excited for what He will do next. Living with expectancy doesn't mean we'll never face disappointment or difficulty. It doesn't mean that everything will always go according to our plans, but it does mean that we approach life with the belief that God is always at work, that His promises are sure, and that our best days are ahead of us. It's a life filled with hope, anticipation, and trust in God's ability to bring about His will in His time. It's a life that is constantly looking forward to what God will do next, knowing that He is faithful and will never leave us or forsake us.